They thought he was bluffing, just another African leader with fire in his words, but no match for the powers that pull the strings from Paris, Tel Aviv, and Washington. By morning, his speeches would fade into yesterday's headlines forgotten like so many before him. That's what they believed about President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, until last Thursday at exactly 7:10 a.m. No warnings, no leaks, no grandstanding, just the rumble of military trucks rolling into a quiet district on the eastern edge of Ouagadougou. Within minutes, an operation was underway that would send shockwaves far beyond West Africa. By nightfall, the tremors were felt in the foreign ministries of 3 world capitals, and this time it wasn't just another crackdown. It was a declaration, a message that Africa would no longer be treated as someone else's chessboard, not in silence, not without resistance. For decades, Burkina Faso, like much of Africa, had been told to be grateful for aid and partnerships that came with invisible strings. Surveillance disguised as development, influence dressed up as cooperation. But last week, one of Africa's youngest leaders cut those strings in a single calculated move. What happened in Ouagadougou was not just about politics, it was about memory, sovereignty, and dignity reclaimed piece by piece. And it forces us to ask a question that may define Africa's next chapter. Is this the dawn of a continental awakening, or just one lone act of rebellion destined to be crushed? If you believe that Africa's awakening has already begun, if you believe that courage in the face of power is still possible, stay with us until the very end of this story. Because what President Ibrahim Traoré did last Thursday is already rewriting the rules not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation that dares to stand. Please share this if you believe Africa is no longer for sale. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. It began with the sound of engines, heavy, deliberate, unhurried. At exactly 7:00 a.m., columns of olive green military trucks rolled through a sleepy neighborhood on the eastern edge of Ouagadougou. Residents peeked through curtains and balcony railings, unsure if they were witnessing a routine drill or the start of something far bigger. Within minutes, the trucks came to a stop outside a plain 3-story office building. There were no corporate banners, no flashy logos, just a single metal plaque with the name of what appeared to be a modest telecommunications firm. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than another small piece of the city's business landscape, but to President Ibrahim Traoré's administration, this was Target 1, a suspected front for a covert, Israeli-backed intelligence operation quietly siphoning data across West Africa. The soldiers moved with precision. Doors were breached, hallways cleared. Inside, special units began collecting encrypted phones, high-capacity hard drives, boxes of classified documents and servers that hummed with the quiet intensity of secrets not meant to be found. Every movement was methodical, rehearsed. Within less than an hour, the entire facility was under control. No shots fired, no alarms raised. But this was only the opening move. Simultaneously, across the city and in other strategic locations, 6 more sites were being raided, each one tied to Israeli defense or surveillance networks operating under the guise of commercial enterprise. Cybersecurity firms, development NGOs, and even a drone technology provider, all of them swept up in a coordinated operation that spanned the capital like a tightening net. By 9:00 a.m., the network had been dismantled. The orders were clear. All infrastructure was to be seized, systems shut down, and assets frozen. And it was done without a single warning or explanation to the companies involved. This was not a request for compliance. It was a clean break. At noon, President Traoré stepped before the press. The atmosphere was tense. Journalists leaned forward expecting a fiery denunciation or a list of accusations. Instead, they got just 9 words spoken calmly, but with unshakable conviction. Africa is not your blind spot anymore. He said nothing else. There was no need. By that point, the message had already been delivered in the clearest possible terms. Behind those few words was a strategy that had been months in the making. Traoré understood that modern power rarely arrives on the battlefield anymore. It slips in through contracts, aid programs, and fiber optic cables labeled as development projects. It embeds itself quietly, invisibly, until it holds veto power over national decisions. Thursday morning was his way of telling the world Burkina Faso was done playing that game. In the hours that followed, the government issued a cascade of orders, immediate termination of every Israeli defense and surveillance contract in the country, cancellation of technology sharing agreements, including those involving drones, cybersecurity, and intelligence frameworks built over the last decade, freezing and review of NGO operations suspected of acting as cover for intelligence gathering, expulsion of individuals, both civilian and diplomatic, with documented or suspected ties to foreign espionage networks. Military escorts were dispatched to ensure compliance. Offices were emptied. Equipment was boxed, sealed, and removed under armed guard. Some foreign staff were given less than 24 hours to leave the country. By nightfall, the operation was complete. What had existed that morning as a sprawling web of foreign influence had been reduced to a collection of sealed crates and locked doors. There was no violence, no chaos, only the sense that something deeply rooted had been cleanly, decisively cut away. In that single day, Burkina Faso had not just resisted foreign interference, it had dismantled it. And in doing so, Traoré had drawn a line in the sand that other nations would soon notice. By midday, the dust from the morning raids had barely settled when a second wave of consequences began to unfold, swift, unflinching, and unmistakable in intent. At exactly 12 hours at noon, President Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the podium in the main press hall of the presidential compound. The room was packed. Reporters from local radio stations sat beside foreign correspondents, all waiting for a detailed briefing, perhaps even a dramatic confrontation with the media. But Traoré did not give them the spectacle they expected. He simply adjusted the microphone, looked straight into the cameras, and delivered 9 words. Africa is not your blind spot anymore. No raised voice. No accusatory finger-pointing. Just a measured tone that carried more weight than any fiery speech could have. It was a statement that could be played in 30 seconds on television, but one that would echo for decades in political circles. From that moment, the operation shifted from a national security maneuver to a continental statement. Within hours of Traoré's brief address, an executive order was signed canceling all existing contracts with Israeli defense and surveillance companies' drones, cybersecurity software, satellite communications, intelligence sharing frameworks, everything that had been quietly woven into Burkina Faso's infrastructure over the past decade. The purge was not limited to technology. Several non-governmental organizations, long suspected of serving as fronts for intelligence gathering, received sealed envelopes from the Ministry of Interior. Inside, formal notices to vacate premises within 24 hours. No appeals, no negotiations. Military trucks pulled up to their offices, and soldiers began escorting staff out of the buildings carrying their personal belongings in small boxes. Computers and files were seized, doors were locked and sealed with government tape. In perhaps the most symbolic move of the day, diplomats with known intelligence backgrounds, names whispered but never officially acknowledged, were quietly declared persona non grata. Their departures were not announced on national television. There were no press conferences to humiliate them. But by the next morning, the images told the story. Black embassy cars loaded with luggage, satellite communication dishes, dismantled from rooftops, foreign consultants driven away under armed escort. And still, this was only the beginning of the ripple effect. Within 72 hours, the shockwaves reached across borders. Mali, Burkina Faso's northern neighbor and ally in the AES alliance of Sahel states, announced it was freezing all Israeli military technology imports. Guinea suspended its joint cyber initiatives, with foreign contractors suspected of backdoor surveillance links. Niger launched a formal review of all foreign-backed infrastructure and technology contracts, many of them connected to the same Israeli-linked companies dismantled in Burkina Faso. 3 countries, 3 days. The regional press began calling it the West African Firewall, a coordinated barrier against foreign espionage and covert control. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, panic set in. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu convened an emergency national security meeting late into the night. Leaked transcripts later published by Israeli media revealed a deep sense of alarm. One senior advisor was quoted as saying, "This isn't about Burkina Faso anymore. He's building a wall against us." In Paris, the French government, usually among the first to respond to shifts in West African politics, remained conspicuously silent. No condemnation, no defense of mutual partnerships. The silence was louder than any official statement. In Washington, the State Department issued a brief and vague comment, urging restraint and dialogue. But behind closed doors, analysts were rattled. For decades, U.S. intelligence strategy in Africa had depended on quiet compliance and predictable alliances. Now, one of the youngest presidents on the continent had demonstrated that those ties could be severed overnight, and others were following his lead. The reaction in Brussels was equally telling. The European Union convened a closed-door session on foreign access threats in West Africa. No formal resolutions were made public, but sources inside the meeting said the mood was one of unease. The problem was clear. If they pushed back too aggressively, they risked confirming Traoré's accusations of covert interference. If they stayed silent, they risked losing strategic ground across the entire region. But perhaps the most significant reaction wasn't in a foreign ministry, it was in the streets of Ouagadougou. As the sun began to set that Thursday, crowds gathered outside the presidential compound. Not in protest, but in celebration. Young men waved the national flag. Mothers sang traditional songs. Students held up hand-painted signs, "Africa is not for sale." "No more shadows. We are not your resource." It was as if an invisible fog had lifted from the city. People spoke openly about the sense of sovereignty they hadn't felt in years, about decisions being made in Burkina Faso for Burkina Faso. In markets, cafes, and university lecture halls, conversations turned not to fear of retaliation, but to pride in leadership. A popular radio host summed it up during an evening broadcast. "He didn't just expel spies, he expelled our silence." This was the emotional climax of the week. A nation that had been told for decades to keep its head down was now standing tall, and their leader had done it without a single bullet fired. No chaos, no civil unrest. Just a clean, disciplined act of sovereignty that dared the rest of the continent to follow. And follow they would. The morning after the operation, Ouagadougou woke up to a new reality. The streets were calm, the markets open, children in their school uniforms walking hand in hand. There was no sign of the unrest many foreign analysts had predicted. Instead, there was an almost palpable sense of relief, like a weight no one could name had finally been lifted. For ordinary citizens, the raids were more than a national security measure. They were a public statement that the days of quiet submission were over. In conversation after conversation, people spoke of something far more profound than politics. They spoke of self-worth. Vendors in the central market told journalists, "We finally feel like someone is protecting us, not selling us." University students debated the implications of the move, framing it not as isolationism, but as an overdue act of sovereignty. Civil impact inside Burkina Faso. The government, anticipating the risk of misinformation or foreign propaganda, launched a nationwide communication campaign. State radio and local TV stations explained the nature of the raids, the reasons for contract cancellations, and the safeguards being implemented to replace any lost technology with domestically controlled systems. This transparency built trust. Instead of fear or doubt, citizens responded with support and even volunteerism. Young IT specialists offered their services to help secure government networks. Local engineers proposed solutions to fill gaps left by foreign firms. The lack of violence was itself a powerful signal. In a region where political purges often turned bloody, Traoré's operation had been surgical and disciplined. Not a single civilian was harmed, and not a single protest turned violent. This restraint earned the administration credibility both at home and across the continent. Political consequences across the region. Within days, the West African Firewall concept was openly discussed in regional political forums. Mali, Guinea, and Niger, already following Burkina Faso's lead, began pushing for a collective security doctrine that would require member states to audit and, if necessary, expel covert foreign influence. In diplomatic terms, this was revolutionary, the shift from reactive country-by-country measures to a coordinated multi-state defense of sovereignty. The African Union, often criticized for slow and cautious responses, found itself under pressure to act. Burkina delegates submitted a proposal for an AU resolution, formally recognizing the right of member states to dismantle covert networks operating under the cover of foreign aid or commercial investment. The proposal also called for a continental intelligence sharing platform that would exclude non-African powers from oversight. Tensions with traditional partners. In Western capitals, the unease was tangible. For France, the absence of an official statement was not an oversight, it was a calculated silence. Any condemnation would lend weight to Traoré's accusations. Any defense would expose the depth of their involvement in the region's affairs. In Washington, while public statements remained vague, classified assessments flagged Burkina Faso as a pivot point in Africa's political trajectory. Officials worried that if Traoré's model proved sustainable both politically and economically, it could trigger a cascade of similar moves across the continent, eroding decades of carefully built influence. Domestic political strengthening. Inside Burkina Faso, the events of that Thursday became a rallying point for Traoré's administration. Opposition voices normally quick to accuse the government of overreach were quieter, perhaps recognizing the overwhelming public approval. Civic groups began framing the operation as a case study in nonviolent reclamation of sovereignty. Even critics had to acknowledge the strategic clarity removing foreign influence did not plunge the nation into chaos, nor did it sever all ties with the outside world. Instead, it reset the terms of engagement. Burkina Faso would still cooperate internationally, but on its own terms without hidden strings. By the end of the first week, the narrative had shifted. What began as a sudden high-stakes raid was now being discussed in academic panels, civil society meetings, and even in cafes, as the moment Burkina Faso stood up and redrew the boundaries of its political identity. In the eyes of many, the political and civil impact was not merely defensive, it was generative. It didn't just remove a threat, it created a template for what sovereignty could look like in the 21st century. From Washington to Brussels to Tel Aviv, the events in Ouagadougou were read as more than a local political maneuver. They were seen as a direct challenge to a long-standing geopolitical architecture. In the United States, official statements remained deliberately vague. The State Department called for restraint and dialogue, framing the situation as a bilateral misunderstanding rather than a regional shift. But inside the Pentagon and intelligence agencies, the tone was markedly different. Classified briefings warned that Traoré's model, swift, nonviolent, and legally justified, was harder to discredit than the coups and uprisings Washington was used to condemning. Analysts noted that if just 2 or 3 more countries adopted similar measures, the U.S. intelligence footprint in West Africa could be significantly reduced. Policy think tanks in D.C. debated the long-term risk. Was Burkina Faso an isolated case driven by a charismatic young leader or the beginning of a coordinated African doctrine? The phrase Troy Doctrine, once confined to African media, began appearing in Western policy papers, described as a threat to operational visibility and strategic influence on the continent. In Europe, the reactions were layered with caution. Brussels convened emergency sessions on foreign access vulnerabilities in Africa, but made no public announcements. European intelligence services recognized the danger of a domino effect, particularly if EU endorsement of sovereign resistance passed. For France, Burkina Faso's former colonial ruler, the stakes were personal as well as strategic. French policymakers feared that Traoré's defiance might encourage other Francophone nations to dismantle Paris's remaining security and economic networks in the region. In Israel, the response was immediate and defensive. Netanyahu's emergency security meeting framed the incident not as a diplomatic rift, but as an operational crisis. Military and intelligence planners scrambled to assess the damage, not just the loss of specific contracts, but the broader precedent, an African nation openly identifying and dismantling covert Israeli-linked networks without fear of reprisal. Leaked Israeli analyses warned that if Burkina Faso's example spread, Israel's defense export market in Africa could contract sharply, costing billions annually and undermining key regional partnerships. Globally, reactions split along ideological lines. In parts of Latin America and Asia, media outlets framed Traoré's move as a bold stand for self-determination, drawing parallels to anti-colonial movements of the 20th century. In African diaspora communities from New York to London to Paris, activists seized on the moment as proof that African leadership could act decisively without waiting for foreign approval. For the West, the dilemma was stark: respond aggressively and risk proving Traoré's point, or stay silent and allow his doctrine to gain legitimacy. For the global South, the lesson was equally clear: sovereignty is not merely declared, it is enforced. In the end, what happened in Burkina Faso was not just a rejection of external interference, it was the introduction of a new diplomatic posture, one in which Africa chooses its allies on its own terms and dares the rest of the world to adjust. In the days and weeks following that Thursday morning, one thing became clear: Burkina Faso had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. What began as a series of synchronized raids had evolved into a new reference point in African politics, a demonstration that sovereignty could be reclaimed without bloodshed, without foreign permission, and without apology. Inside the country, the mood was one of pride, but also vigilance. People knew the world would not stand by idly. Retaliation might not come in the form of troops or tanks, it could arrive through economic pressure, sanctions, or covert destabilization. History had shown that when smaller nations challenge entrenched power, the counterpunch is often subtle but relentless. And yet Traoré's government appeared ready. The strategy that dismantled covert networks was now being expanded into a broader doctrine, one that demanded total transparency for foreign investment, zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence presence, and collective African defense against interference. What some in the West saw as defiance, many Africans saw as a survival blueprint. Beyond Burkina Faso, the Troy Doctrine was already being studied in neighboring capitals. Draft legislation in Mali and Guinea mirrored its principles. Niger's government had begun a forensic review of every foreign-backed contract signed in the past decade. Across the Sahel, whispers of quiet resistance were becoming public declarations. For the West, the challenge is existential: adapt to a relationship with Africa based on respect and equal footing, or watch influence erode as African states close ranks. For Africa, the challenge is just as great: maintain unity and discipline in the face of both external pressure and internal temptation. And this is where the warning lies. It is one thing to take a stand, it is another to sustain it. The forces that profit from Africa's dependence will not disappear quietly. Economic deals will be dangled, divisions will be sown. Leaders will be flattered, bribed, or threatened back into compliance. If the continent falters, this moment risks being remembered not as the start of a new era, but as a brief spark extinguished by familiar patterns. But if it holds, if leaders and citizens alike defend this line in the sand, history will record it as the point where Africa began speaking with one voice. A voice not dictated from Brussels, Washington, or Tel Aviv, but from Ouagadougou, Bamako, Conakry, and beyond. So the question comes to you: do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or should Africa look for new leaders to carry this fight forward? If you believe that the spirit of sovereignty must outlast the headlines, share this story. Subscribe if you believe the truth is worth defending. Because the world is watching, and what happens next will shape not just the future of Burkina Faso, but the fate of a continent.